Nyala's eyes snapped open. This wasn't her bed. This wasn't her room. And the shirt on her body, it wasn't hers. A slow, deep voice cut through the silence. "You're finally awake." She turned sharply and froze. A man stood by the balcony, watching her. Tall, white, powerful, and utterly unfamiliar. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. On this blessed Sunday, I have a special prayer for each and every one of you. May your hearts be filled with love, your minds with peace, and your days with endless joy. No matter what you're going through, know that you are loved, cherished, and never alone. And now, my beautiful family, I have some great news. Mr. Peter will be available within 1 week. I hope you're satisfied with my work so far, but if Mr. Peter were to ask you, how many marks out of 10 would you give me? Be honest. Now, let's take the attendance. Drop your names in the comments so I can see who's here. And with love in our hearts, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Awakening. A Woman in the Wrong Bed. Sunlight pierced through intricately carved wooden shutters, falling across Nyala Adebayo's face and pulling her from the depths of dreamless sleep. Her head throbbed with each beat of her heart, mouth dry as desert sand. She shifted against silken sheets, silken, and froze. These weren't her sheets. This wasn't her bed. This wasn't her room. Nyala bolted upright, instantly regretting the sudden movement as pain lanced through her skull. The spacious bedroom swam into focus. High ceilings, polished wooden floors, minimalist furniture that whispered of wealth and privilege. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city skyline with her village's mountains beyond. A penthouse. She was in a penthouse. Glancing down, she discovered with horror that she wore nothing but an oversized man's shirt, the scent of cedar wood and something dangerously masculine clinging to the fabric. Her clothes. Where were her clothes? I was starting to think you'd never wake up. The deep voice sent shivers racing down her spine. Nyala clutched the sheet to her chest, eyes darting to the doorway where he stood. Tall, white, powerful. He leaned against the doorframe with casual confidence, watching her through storm-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. His dark hair fell in careless waves, framing features that belonged on ancient coins, all sharp angles and quiet authority. "Who are you?" Nyala demanded, proud that her voice didn't betray her fear. "Where am I?" "Callum Ashford," he replied, remaining where he was as if sensing her need for space. "And this is my home." The name registered instantly. Callum Ashford, the wealthiest developer in the region, owner of the gleaming tower that had risen on land once belonging to her people. The outsider who'd arrived 5 years ago and transformed the landscape with his vision and fortune. "Why am I here?" Each word felt like broken glass in her dry throat. Callum crossed to a side table, poured water from a crystal pitcher, and approached the bed. He stopped several feet away, extending the glass without coming closer. "You were at the Harvest Festival in your village last night," he explained as she cautiously accepted the water. "You had too much ceremonial wine. Your cousin Kofi asked me to ensure you got home safely, but you..." He hesitated, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "You were in no state for the journey." Fragments of memory returned, lanterns strung between trees, drums pounding in time with her heartbeat, the sweet potency of ritual wine burning down her throat as village elders blessed the harvest. Dancing. She remembered dancing under stars that seemed to pulse with ancestral energy. "Why would Kofi ask you?" Suspicion edged her voice. "You're an outsider." Something flickered across Callum's face. "I was there as an invited guest. The village elders and I have been working on a land restoration project." Nyala's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't explain why I'm wearing your shirt, or why I'm in your bed." "Your dress got wet when you decided dancing in the sacred river was a good idea," he replied, a note of amusement warming his tone. "One of the village women helped you change. As for the bed, I slept elsewhere." Heat rose to Nyala's cheeks, swimming in the sacred river. What had possessed her? The ceremonial wine was potent, yes, but she'd never done anything so reckless during previous festivals. "I need to leave," she stated, gathering the sheet around her. "My family will be worried." "I sent word with one of my staff," Callum assured her, stepping back to give her more space. "Your mother knows you're safe." The pounding in her head intensified as she tried to process everything. Something wasn't right. Something beyond waking up in a stranger's shirt, in a stranger's bed. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. Callum's expression shifted, caution replacing amusement. "What makes you think I'm withholding something?" "Your eyes," Nyala said simply. "They're guarded, like a man carrying secrets." A beat of silence stretched between them. Callum moved to the window, looking out over the mountains rather than at her. "There was a ceremony," he finally said, "at the festival, after your swim in the river." Cold dread pooled in Nyala's stomach. What kind of ceremony? A binding ceremony. His voice remained carefully neutral. "With the sacred tokens and traditional witnesses." The room tilted slightly as implications crashed over her. A binding ceremony, the ancient ritual that joined two people in marriage according to her people's traditions. A ceremony performed only after months of preparation, negotiation between families, blessings from ancestors. "That's impossible," she whispered. We couldn't have." Callum turned from the window, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small wooden token wrapped in red thread, the physical symbol of their binding. "You were quite insistent," he said quietly. "You spoke of visions, of your grandmother's spirit guiding you." The elders seemed surprised but didn't object. Nyala's grandmother, the village's most respected diviner before her death 3 years ago. The woman who had passed her second sight to Nyala, who had appeared in her dreams with increasing frequency these past months. "No," Nyala shook her head, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "This is absurd. I don't even know you." "And yet, according to your village laws and traditions," Callum replied, his expression unreadable, "we are married." The word hung in the air between them, impossible and irrefutable. "This can be undone," Nyala insisted, mind racing. "The binding isn't complete until—" She stopped, unwilling to speak the words. "Until consummation," Callum finished for her, no trace of mockery in his tone. "Which didn't happen. As I said, I slept elsewhere." Relief washed through her, followed immediately by determination. "Then we go to the elders today, explain the mistake, request annulment." Callum inclined his head slightly. "If that's what you want." His easy acquiescence surprised her. Men of his wealth and power rarely surrendered without fight. "Why did you agree?" Nyala couldn't stop herself from asking. "To the ceremony? You were sober, weren't you?" "Completely." A shadow passed over his features. "As for why, perhaps that's a conversation for after you've dressed." He gestured to where her traditional dress lay folded on a chair, then moved toward the door. "The bathroom is through there. I'll prepare something for your headache." Left alone, Nyala pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. Married to Callum Ashford, the outsider who represented everything her village resisted: wealth, modernization, change. What had possessed her? What vision or madness had driven her to bind herself to a man she'd never met before last night? As she rose from the bed, a memory surfaced, not from the festival, but from dreams that had haunted her for months. A tall figure with storm-gray eyes watching her from shadow. A presence that should have frightened her, but instead felt like recognition. Nyala shivered, suddenly cold despite the morning warmth. Had her grandmother's divining gift manifested in ways she hadn't expected? Had she somehow known Callum Ashford before she ever met him? One thing was certain: she needed answers, and she needed her freedom. Whatever strange magic had ensnared her last night, she would break it in the clear light of day. But as she moved to collect her dress, Nyala caught her reflection in a mirror, her features overlaid for just an instant with her grandmother's knowing smile. Some bindings, her grandmother had often said, are written in the stars long before we recognize them. Chapter 2. The First Shock, a Marriage She Never Chose. Let Me Pass. Nyala stood at the penthouse elevator, chin raised despite the pounding in her head. She had changed into her now dry traditional dress, desperate to escape the luxurious penthouse that felt increasingly like a gilded cage. Callum remained beside the elevator doors, not blocking them exactly, but his presence creating an obstacle nonetheless. "We should talk before you go to the village." "I'll speak with the elders myself," Nyala replied, clutching her bag tighter. "At least let me drive you," he offered. "It's a long journey on foot." "I'll manage." The last thing she wanted was to arrive in Callum Ashford's sleek vehicle, confirming whatever gossip was already spreading. Callum sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Nyala, rushing into the village without understanding what happened won't help either of us." "What's to understand?" she challenged. "I was drunk. You were..." "Completely sober," Callum finished. "I don't drink during sacred ceremonies." The confirmation sent a fresh wave of panic through her. If he'd been sober, why hadn't he stopped this? "Then you took advantage of my state," she accused, eyes flashing. His expression hardened. "I did no such thing. You approached me by the sacred fire, speaking of dreams and signs. You said your grandmother's spirit had been guiding you for months." Cold recognition shivered through Nyala. These were private thoughts she'd never shared. The sensation of her grandmother's presence, the dreams of a stranger with storm-gray eyes. "I would never reveal such things to an outsider," she insisted, though uncertainty colored her voice. "You called me by name before we were introduced," Callum continued quietly. "You knew about the scar on my shoulder, a childhood injury no one here could possibly know about." Nyala struggled to maintain her composure. Her grandmother's divining gift was unpredictable, manifesting differently in each generation. Had her own gift connected her to this man? "It doesn't matter," she said firmly. "Whatever happened was influenced by ceremonial wine. The binding must be dissolved." Callum studied her face, then stepped aside. "As you wish." The journey to the village passed in tense silence. Despite her protests, they traveled in his vehicle, a practical concession she already regretted, as people stopped to stare when they arrived. The elders' chamber stood at the village center, a circular stone building where generations had made important decisions. Inside, 5 elders sat in their customary semicircle, including her uncle Ikene, whose expression remained unreadable. "Daughter of our soil," Elder Amara spoke first. "You return to us changed." "Not changed," Nyala countered. "There has been a mistake." Elder Kamau leaned forward. "What mistake do you perceive, daughter?" "The binding ceremony. I was intoxicated and couldn't have understood what I was agreeing to." The elders exchanged glances. Her uncle cleared his throat. "The ceremonial wine reveals truth, already present within. It does not invent desires." "I had never met this man before last night," Nyala protested. "Hadn't you?" Elder Amara's penetrating gaze seemed to see through her. "Your grandmother's divining gift flows in your veins. Perhaps you knew him in ways beyond physical meeting." Unsettled, Nyala changed tactics. A binding ceremony requires preparation, family negotiation. None of that occurred. "Your uncle represented your family interests," Elder Kamau replied. He deemed the match advantageous. Betrayal sliced through Nyala as she turned to her uncle. "You sanctioned this?" "I recognized opportunity," Ikeni answered without apology. "The joining of our bloodline with Ashford's offers protection for our village, access to resources we need." "You sold me," Nyala whispered, horror dawning. "I secured our future," he corrected sharply. Callum, who had remained respectfully silent, finally spoke. "I was led to understand Nyala acted of her own volition, that the ceremonial aspects were her choice." "She did choose," Ikeni insisted. "The wine simply gave her courage to acknowledge what was necessary." Fury rose in Nyala's throat. "I demand annulment. The binding hasn't been consummated." A heavy silence fell. Elder Amara sighed before answering. "You may request this, but you must understand the consequences." "What consequences?" Nyala asked, though something in her already knew. "Breaking a sacred binding marks one as Oathbreaker," Elder Kamau explained gravely. "No man of our people could take you afterward. Your standing in ceremonies would be diminished, your voice in council silenced. You would remain our daughter," Elder Amara added softly, "but altered in position." The full weight of their words crashed over Nyala. Being marked as Oathbreaker wasn't merely social stigma, but spiritual exile, a half-life within her own community. "This is manipulation," she said through clenched teeth. "This is tradition," her uncle corrected coldly. "Tradition that has sustained our people for generations." Callum's voice cut through the tension. "And what of my wishes? Am I bound without choice as well?" Elder Kamau turned to Callum. "You were sober during the ceremony, outsider. You spoke the words willingly." "Under the impression that Nyala had chosen me specifically," Callum challenged, "not as part of a political arrangement." "Your reasons matter less than your commitment," Ikeni replied dismissively. Elder Amara raised her hand, silencing further argument. "You have until the next full moon to consummate the union or seek annulment. 7 days to decide your path, daughter." As they exited the chamber, villagers gathered to watch. Nyala felt their judgment like a physical weight. Her childhood friend Isi turned away when their eyes met. Her cousin Kofi couldn't meet her gaze at all. "You shared a bed with him," someone whispered loud enough to be heard. "You are no longer one of us." The whispered accusation was quickly followed by others. Fingers pointed. Children were pulled away as if she carried some contagion. When she spotted her family compound, she moved toward it instinctively, needing her mother's wisdom, her father's protection. But the gate was barred, her youngest sister Makina's face appearing briefly in the window before disappearing behind drawn curtains. The message was unmistakable. She was unwelcome. "Take me back," she said to Callum, her voice hollow with the shock of complete rejection. "To the penthouse." As they walked toward his vehicle, surrounded by whispers and stares, Nyala felt something inside her harden into resolve. Her world had been upended in a single night. Her community, her family, her very identity now hanging in precarious balance. In a matter of hours, she had gone from respected village daughter to outcast. And beside her walked the man at the center of it all, Callum Ashford, her husband in name, a stranger in truth, yet mysteriously connected to her through forces she was only beginning to understand. She had 7 days to decide, become truly his wife or face permanent exile from everything she had ever known. Neither choice offered the freedom she had always taken for granted. The first shock of her new reality settled into her bones as the village disappeared behind them. She was married to a man she barely knew, and the life she had lived until yesterday was already gone forever. Chapter 3. Caught Between Worlds. 3 days passed in Callum's penthouse, 3 days of uneasy silence and careful distance. They established territories, invisible boundaries neither crossed. Callum worked in his home office while Nyala explored the vast space that was theoretically now partially hers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views that constantly reminded her of her predicament. The gleaming city on one side representing Callum's world, the ancient mountains on the other representing her own. And she caught between, belonging to neither. On the evening of the third day, Nyala stood at those windows watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. The physical distance to her village was minimal, barely an hour's drive, but the emotional chasm felt unbridgeable after her family's rejection. "There's a call for you," Callum said from the doorway, interrupting her thoughts. "Your cousin, Kofi." Surprise momentarily overwhelmed her wariness. "Kofi called here. He said it's important." Callum held out a sleek phone, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll give you privacy." Alone, Nyala pressed the phone to her ear. "Kofi?" "Nyala." Her cousin's voice was hushed, urgent. "I'm sorry about what happened. The way they treated you wasn't right." "Yet you did nothing," she replied, bitterness seeping into her tone. "I'm doing something now," he countered. "Listen carefully. Your uncle has been meeting with foreign men, powerful, dangerous men looking for Callum." The news sent ice through her veins. "What men? Why would they want Callum?" "I don't know exactly." Kofi's voice dropped further. "But I heard one name, Ashford, like your husband's." "His father," Nyala realized with sudden clarity. "His father is looking for him. Whatever it is, it's not good. Your uncle received payment. Gold." A pause. "Nyala, be careful. These men, they don't care about our ways. They only want Callum." After the call ended, Nyala remained by the window, mind racing. She knew little about Callum's past beyond what village gossip had provided. That he was wealthy, powerful, that he had built his tower against his family's wishes, preferring independence to inheritance. But why would his father send men looking for him? Why would her uncle betray the sacred law of hospitality for gold? Lightning flashed across the darkening sky, momentarily illuminating her reflection in the glass. A woman she barely recognized, caught between worlds, facing threats she didn't fully understand. "Bad news?" Callum asked, returning with 2 steaming cups. The aroma of cardamom and ginger, her village's traditional tea, rose from them. "You had this brought in," she observed, accepting a cup. A slight shrug. "I asked your cousin which blend you preferred when he called earlier." The simple kindness touched something raw within her. "Kofi says my uncle has been meeting with men looking for you. Your father's men." Callum's face hardened, his fingers tightening around his cup. "Austin, I should have known he wouldn't let go easily." "Why would your father send men after you?" she asked directly. "What are you running from?" Setting down his cup, Callum moved to stand beside her at the window. "Not what? Who?" "My father is controlling, manipulative. He built an empire through methods I couldn't stomach, and when I refused to follow in his footsteps, he took it personally." Lightning flashed again, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "I left 5 years ago, built my own company, my own life. He's never forgiven what he sees as betrayal. And he would harm you, his own son. Austin Ashford sees people as assets or liabilities, nothing more." His voice remained steady, but Nyala sensed old pain beneath. Even family. The revelation shifted something between them, this shared understanding of rejection by those who should have offered unconditional love. Her family had cast her out for defying tradition. His father pursued him for defying expectation. "The full moon is in 4 days," Callum said quietly. "Whatever you decide about our situation, we need to be careful until then. If Austin's men are working with your uncle, neither the village nor this penthouse may be safe." The deadline loomed over her: consummate the marriage or face permanent exile. A choice that had seemed impossible days ago now competed with this new threat. Thunder cracked overhead, rain beginning to lash against the windows. Callum moved away, giving her space to process. "I could sell the tower," he offered unexpectedly. "Relocate. Give you a fresh start somewhere Austin couldn't find us. Somewhere you could build a new life without the shadow of either family hanging over you." The offer stunned her, that he would consider abandoning everything he'd built just to ensure her safety and freedom. "You would do that? For a woman you barely know." His eyes, the color of the storm outside, met hers directly. "For the woman who, according to your traditions, is my wife. For the woman who has lost everything because of a connection neither of us fully understands." Lightning flashed again as they stood facing each other, the air between them charged with something beyond the storm's electricity. Nyala felt it, that inexplicable pull that had drawn her to him at the festival, that sense of recognition that transcended logic. "Why didn't you stop the ceremony?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for days finally finding voice. "You were sober. You could have refused." For a moment, Callum seemed to struggle for words. "Because when you looked at me across the sacred fire, I felt known, in a way I've never experienced." He shook his head, embarrassed by the admission. "It sounds absurd." "It doesn't," she interrupted, her pulse quickening. "I've been having dreams about you for months before we met, dreams I told no one about." The confession hung between them, confirmation of something neither could rationalize away. Whatever had drawn them together that night went deeper than wine or manipulation. Thunder shook the building as their gazes held, the distance between them suddenly charged with possibility. Nyala was acutely aware of him, his height, his warmth, the subtle scent of cedarwood that had clung to his shirt she'd worn that first morning. "Nyala," he said, her name almost a question on his lips. Before either could move, the lights flickered, then died, plunging the penthouse into darkness, broken only by lightning flashes. The storm had knocked out power. Callum moved with practiced ease despite the darkness, retrieving candles from a drawer. As he lit them, the warm glow created intimate pools of light in the vast space, transforming it from imposing to almost magical. "The generator should activate for essential systems," he explained, placing candles on the coffee table. "But the rest will stay dark until power returns." They sat together in candlelight, the storm raging outside, unexpected intimacy created by darkness and shared confidences. For the first time since awakening in his bed, Nyala felt something besides confusion or resentment toward Callum, a fragile trust building between them. "Whatever your decision about the marriage," he said as lightning illuminated his face in flashes, "I promise you won't face it alone. Whether as husband or simply ally, I'll ensure you have choices, Nyala. Real choices, not the false ones your elders or my father would force upon us." In that moment, with rain drumming against glass and candles flickering between them, Nyala felt a subtle shift within herself, the first crack in the wall of resentment she'd built around her heart. This man, this stranger who was her husband in name, had offered what no one else had, the freedom to choose her own path forward. And with that realization came another, more unsettling one. She was no longer certain what choice she would make when the full moon arrived. Chapter 4: Passion and Hatred Collide. Thunder rumbled across the night sky as Nyala stood at the penthouse windows, watching lightning illuminate the mountains that had rejected her. 3 days had passed since her family's devastating dismissal. 3 days of simmering rage and bone-deep grief. Callum had come for her as promised, arriving in his sleek black vehicle just as rain began to fall. Without words, he'd placed his jacket around her shoulders and guided her inside, his hand hovering near her elbow but never quite touching. Always that careful distance. The journey back to the penthouse had passed in silence, her tears falling in rhythm with the rain streaking the windows. He hadn't pressed for explanations, hadn't offered hollow comfort. His quiet presence had been enough, a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. Now, 3 days later, Nyala still hadn't decided her path forward. The full moon approached, bringing with it the deadline set by the elders. Consummate the marriage or face annulment and exile, become Callum Ashford's true wife, or lose her identity, her heritage, her place in the world. A knock at the doorway pulled her from these thoughts. Callum stood there, 2 steaming cups in his hands. "I thought you might want this," he said, offering one to her. Nyala accepted the cup, the familiar aroma of cardamom and ginger rising with the steam. Her village's traditional blend, not the imported teas she'd seen in his kitchen. "You had this brought in," she observed, taking a cautious sip. A slight shrug. "I asked your cousin Kofi which blend you preferred." Kofi, the only family member who had contacted her since that day, sending a brief message of stilted apology. She hadn't replied. "Thank you," she said, the simple kindness of the gesture touching something raw within her. Callum leaned against the window frame, his profile illuminated by another flash of lightning. "The full moon is tomorrow night. The deadline. The moment of decision." "I know," she replied softly, turning back to the storm. "Nyala," his voice was gentle but insistent, "I need to know what you want." What did she want? The question seemed impossibly complex and startlingly simple all at once. "I want my life back," she answered honestly, "but that's not possible anymore." Callum set his cup down on a nearby table. "If you choose annulment, I'll provide for you. An apartment in the city. Education, if you want it. A new start." The offer surprised her. "Why would you do that?" "Because none of this is your fault," he replied simply. "And contrary to what your village believes, I'm not a monster." Lightning flashed again, closer now, casting his features in stark relief. In that moment, he looked almost vulnerable, far from the powerful businessman the world knew. "What do you want, Callum?" she asked, the question emerging unbidden. Something flickered across his face. Desire, quickly masked by restraint. "What I want doesn't matter. This situation was forced on you." "But not on you," she pressed, stepping closer. "You were sober that night. You could have refused." "I tried," he admitted, jaw tightening. "You were persuasive." "How?" The question had burned inside her for days. "How did I convince you?" Callum ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "You spoke of visions, of your grandmother's spirit guiding you to me. You said—" He hesitated, meeting her eyes reluctantly. "You said you had dreamed of me for months before we ever met." A chill ran through Nyala that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She had dreamed of a tall stranger with storm-gray eyes, had woken gasping from visions of hands she didn't recognize caressing her skin, had felt a presence watching her as she bathed in the sacred river, though no one had been there. She had told no one of these dreams. "That's impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Callum's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly. "Then they were real? The dreams?" Nyala turned away, unsettled by the intensity of his gaze. "It doesn't matter. Dreams are just dreams." "Not in your culture," he countered, moving closer. "Not for the granddaughter of a diviner." "Stop," she said sharply. "Don't pretend to understand my culture, my heritage." "I've spent 5 years learning everything I could about your people," Callum replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Their history, their traditions, their beliefs. While they branded me outsider and thief, I was trying to build something that would benefit both worlds." His passion caught her off guard. "Why? Why bother when they clearly want nothing to do with you?" "Because this land called to me." The words burst from him with unexpected force. From the first moment I saw these mountains, I knew I belonged here, not as conqueror or colonizer, but as, I don't know, as something else, something new. The raw honesty in his voice struck a chord within her. How many times had she felt out of place in her own village? Too ambitious, too questioning, too eager to look beyond the mountains to the wider world. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the sharp planes of his face, the intensity in his eyes. For a moment he looked like something from her dreams, powerful, dangerous, enticing. "The full moon is tomorrow," she said softly. "One way or another, this ends then." Callum stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Does it have to?" The question hung between them, charged as the air before lightning strikes. Niala's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up at him. This man who was technically her husband, this stranger who had somehow invaded her dreams before she ever met him. "I hate what this has done to my life," she whispered, her hands clenching at her sides. "I hate that my family has rejected me. I hate that my community has cast me out." "Me?" he finished for her, his voice low. "Do you hate me, Niala? Did she? Or was this burning sensation whenever he was near something else entirely?" "I should," she replied honestly. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away, before his fingers brushed her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "But do you?" The touch sent electricity coursing through her veins, awakening something primal and hungry. Before she could reconsider, Niala leaned into his palm, her eyes closing briefly at the simple pleasure of human contact after days of isolation. "Niala," Callum murmured, his voice rough with restraint. "If you don't want this, if you're not sure, tell me now." Her eyes opened to find his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her lips. With one word, she could end this. Step away. Choose the path of annulment and independence. Instead, she found herself reaching for him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer until their bodies pressed together. "I don't know what I want tomorrow," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "But tonight, I want this." For a heartbeat, Callum remained perfectly still, searching her eyes for any sign of doubt. Then, with a groan that seemed torn from deep within his chest, he captured her mouth with his. The kiss was nothing like Niala had imagined, and she had imagined it in the dark of night when sleep eluded her. It was heat and hunger and barely restrained power. His hands framed her face with reverence, even as his mouth claimed hers with possession. She kissed him back with equal fervor, years of propriety and restraint dissolving in the face of this overwhelming need. Her hands slid up his chest to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. Callum lifted her effortlessly, carrying her across the room without breaking their kiss. When he laid her on his bed with exquisite care, something wild and untamed broke free inside Niala. She pulled him down, needing his weight, his heat, the solid reality of him. "Are you sure?" he asked against her throat, his voice strained with the effort of control. "Yes," she breathed, arching beneath him. "I want this. I want you." It was madness, it was surrender. It was claiming power she hadn't known she possessed. As storm raged outside and desire raged within, Niala gave herself fully to the moment, to the man, to the inexplicable connection that had brought them together. His hands and mouth discovered every sensitive place on her body, drawing sounds from her she hadn't known she could make. And when he finally joined their bodies, the sense of rightness, of completion, nearly undid her completely. Thunder shook the building as they moved together, finding a rhythm as ancient as the mountains outside. Lightning illuminated their entwined forms as they reached shattering release together, Callum's name on her lips, her mark on his back. In the quiet aftermath, rain pattered against the windows, a gentle counterpoint to their slowing heartbeats. Callum held her close, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, his lips pressing occasional kisses to her temple. No words were needed, no explanations or declarations. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed, changed something fundamental between them that could never be unchanged. Morning arrived with merciless clarity, sunlight streaming through windows they'd forgotten to close. Niala stirred, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped over her waist, the warm breath against her neck. Reality crashed in with brutal force. What had she done? Carefully, she extracted herself from Callum's embrace, wrapping the sheet around her body as she sat at the edge of the bed. He mumbled something in his sleep but didn't wake, giving her a moment to study him unobserved. In sleep, the sharp edges of his face softened. The powerful businessman, the outsider who had disrupted her world, looked almost vulnerable. Last night, she had surrendered to desire, to the inexplicable pull between them. In the light of day, confusion warred with lingering pleasure in her mind. She had consummated their marriage. There would be no annulment now, but what did that mean for her future? For her identity? She was now irrevocably Niala Ashford, wife to a man she barely knew, despite the intimacy they had shared. Callum's eyes opened, finding her immediately. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with sleep. "I don't know," she answered honestly. It was the only truth she had to offer. She didn't regret the pleasure, the connection. But the consequences, those remained to be seen. As sunlight spilled across them both, Niala faced a new reality, one where passion and hatred, desire and resentment, destiny and choice all collided in ways she was only beginning to understand. Chapter 5. The Third Shock. Betrayal by Blood. 2 weeks had passed since the storm-swept night when passion had finally overcome caution. 2 weeks of discovering each other, Niala learning that beneath Callum's powerful exterior lay a man of surprising gentleness. Callum discovering her quick mind and fierce independence. The binding had been consummated, the deadline passed. They were truly husband and wife now. In these weeks, Niala had glimpsed the man behind Callum's public facade. She'd watched him work tirelessly on sustainable development projects, observed how he remembered every staff member's name, discovered his habit of reading poetry when he thought she was asleep. She was beginning to believe there might be a future here, not the life she'd planned, but perhaps one worth embracing. Until the letter arrived. It came by messenger, her cousin Kofi's familiar handwriting on the envelope. She opened it in the privacy of their bedroom, curious what he might say after weeks of minimal contact. Cousin. Tonight, my father meets with 3 Americans in black suits. These men work for Austin Ashford. I overheard them planning to take Callum by force when you are away from the penthouse. My father received payment of gold coins stamped with the Ashford crest. They speak of Callum as the wayward heir, who must be returned to sign control of something called Meridian Holdings to his father before the board meeting next week. Most disturbing, they discuss you as the native problem to be eliminated once the sun is secured. I tell you this because blood is thicker than betrayal. Kofi. Niala read the letter twice, her hands trembling with increasing rage. Not just betrayal of hospitality, but a planned abduction and a threat against her life. She found Callum in his office, reviewing architectural plans for a community center in her village, a project he'd developed to help rebuild bridges with her people. "We have a problem," she announced, handing him the letter. His expression darkened as he read, jaw tightening with each line. "Meridian Holdings," he muttered. "The last company I haven't signed over to independent trustees. Austin's final leverage." "What exactly does your father want from you?" Niala asked. "Why now, after years of separation?" Callum ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Control. The Meridian Board votes next week on whether to divest from weapons manufacturing, something Austin has opposed but can't stop without my shares. He looked up at her, eyes hardening. He's grown desperate, which makes him dangerous. I need to confront my uncle, Nyala decided. Tonight. Stop this before it starts. Absolutely not, Callum countered, already reaching for his phone. If what Kofi says is true, these men would eliminate any obstacle, including you. This is my family's betrayal, she insisted. My responsibility. This is my father's vendetta, Callum replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. I'll increase security, move us to a safe location. No. Nyala crossed her arms. I won't be driven from my home again. I won't hide. Their stares locked in silent battle. Finally, Callum sighed. At least let me send security with you. Not visible, just nearby. Fine, she conceded, but I speak to the elders alone. The village was unnaturally quiet as Nyla approached the elders' chamber. No children played in the twilight. No women gathered at the well. The silence felt calculated, as if the entire community held its breath, waiting. Outside the chamber, she paused, hearing raised voices within. Her uncle Akeen's commanding tone dominated, though she couldn't discern his words. Taking a deep breath, Nyala pushed open the heavy wooden door. 5 elders sat in their ceremonial semicircle, with Akeen standing before them, clearly mid-argument. Behind them stood Kofi, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Nyala, Elder Amara recovered first. You were not summoned. And yet here I am, Nyala replied, stepping forward. Discussing my husband's abduction requires my presence, wouldn't you agree? Ikane's face hardened to stone. You, he hissed, turning to Kofi. You betrayed your own blood. You betrayed sacred hospitality, Kofi countered. You sold information to foreigners. You accepted payment to violate our most ancient laws. Enough, Elder Kamau's voice cut through the tension. Explain yourself, Ikane. These are serious accusations. Ikane drew himself up, defiance written in every line of his body. I did what was necessary for our people. The outsider's father offers technology, medicine, opportunities. In exchange for your nephew by marriage, Elder Amara finished, disgust evident in her tone. A fair trade, Ikane insisted. One outsider for the advancement of many. And what of me? Nyala demanded, stepping closer. Your own niece? Kofi overheard them discussing my elimination. A flicker of something, perhaps shame, crossed Akeen's face before hardening again. Collateral damage. Sometimes sacrifice is required for the greater good. The chamber fell silent, the elders' expressions reflecting shock at this cold calculation. Even in their initial rejection of her marriage, they had never suggested her life was forfeit. When? Nyala asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. When does this abduction happen? Ikane remained silent, but Kofi stepped forward. Tonight. 3 Americans wait at the abandoned hunting lodge. They have weapons, sedatives, a private plane waiting at the airfield. And my father leads them, came a new voice from the doorway. Nyala turned to find Callum standing there, his expression grave. Despite her instructions, he had followed her. The Ashford heir himself, Ikane sneered. Come to beg for protection? No, Callum replied evenly. I came to offer your village a choice. He stepped into the chamber, his height and presence commanding attention, despite being outnumbered. From his pocket, he withdrew a flash drive, placing it before the elders. This contains evidence of Austin Ashford's business practices, environmental violations, labor exploitation, bribery of officials, including, he added, looking directly at Ekene, his recent transactions with your trusted elder. Ikane lunged for the drive, but Elder Kamau was faster, his age belying his reflexes. Violence in the sacred chamber compounds your offense, Ikeni, he said sharply. This evidence goes to authorities if anything happens to either of us, Callum continued calmly. Your village would be investigated, your autonomy compromised, or, he paused, you can expel those who would violate your sacred laws, maintain your integrity, and I will consider the matter closed. A masterful move, Nyala realized. Not a threat, but a choice, preserving the village's dignity while offering a path forward. The elders conferred in hushed tones, their decision swift and unanimous. Elder Amara turned to Ikane, her ancient eyes cold with judgment. You are stripped of elder status, she pronounced. You will leave this village by morning light. Your name will not be spoken in council. The severity of the punishment, virtual erasure from community memory, seemed to finally penetrate Ikeni's arrogance. His shoulders sagged as the weight of consequence settled upon him. The outsiders at the hunting lodge, Elder Kamau asked Kofi. 3 men, armed. The elder nodded gravely. We will send our warriors to escort them from our lands. No, Callum interrupted. My father is dangerous. His men more so. This is my battle. Our battle, Nyala corrected, moving to stand beside him. My husband, my fight. The words felt right on her tongue for the first time, not an arrangement, not a mistake, but a chosen partnership. Elder Amara studied them with ancient, knowing eyes. The diviner's granddaughter and the outsider who refuses his inheritance. Perhaps the ancestors knew what they were doing after all. As they left the chamber, Nyala's hand found Callum's, fingers intertwining with a new certainty. They had confronted one betrayal, but Austin Ashford still waited, the greater threat looming in darkness. What now? She asked as they reached the village edge where Callum's security team waited. Now we end this, Callum replied, his voice quiet but determined. Tonight, they would face Austin together, not as victim and rescuer, not as reluctant spouses, but as equal partners chosen of their own free will. Whatever came next, the final choice would be theirs, not forced upon them by tradition or manipulation. As they drove toward the hunting lodge where Austin waited, Nyala felt a strange calm descend. The third shock of betrayal had crystallized something within her, the certainty that whatever connection had drawn her to Callum that fateful festival night had been no mistake. Perhaps her grandmother's divining spirit had seen this moment coming all along, the moment when two people from different worlds would stand together against forces that sought to control them both. Chapter 6. A desperate gamble. Nyala refused to let Callum die. The thought burned in her mind like a flame as she studied her surroundings through narrowed eyes. They had been separated during the journey, a private jet flight to some unknown destination, followed by a long drive in blacked-out vehicles. When her blindfold was finally removed, she found herself in an opulent bedroom suite that, despite its luxury, was unmistakably a prison. No windows. One door locked from the outside. A silent surveillance camera mounted in the corner. 3 days had passed since their capture. 3 days of isolation broken only by the arrival of meals, delivered by stone-faced staff who refused to answer her questions. 3 days wondering if Callum was even alive, if Austin had already carried out whatever twisted punishment he'd planned for his defiant son. On the morning of the 4th day, Nyala made her decision. She would not wait passively for whatever fate Austin Ashford had designed. She would find Callum. She would free him, and together they would escape. When the silent maid arrived with breakfast, Nyala was ready. She had torn strips from the expensive bed sheets, fashioning them into makeshift rope. As the door opened, she struck, not violently but with swift efficiency, learned from village hunting techniques. The maid's startled cry was muffled by Nyala's palm. "I won't hurt you," she whispered urgently. "I just need information. Where is he? Where's Callum?" Fear widened the woman's eyes, but something else flickered there too, a hint of sympathy. When Nyala slowly removed her hand, the maid didn't scream. "East Wing," she whispered back. "Heavily guarded. You'll never reach him." "I have to try," Nyala insisted. "Help me." The maid hesitated, glancing nervously at the camera. "It's not recording," she admitted. "Just for show. Mr. Ashford's real security is human." Hope flared in Nyala's chest. "Please, I need clothes, staff clothes, and directions." After a moment's calculation, the maid nodded. "Wait here." She returned minutes later with a plain black uniform and a hastily sketched map of the sprawling mansion. "Guards change shifts at noon," she explained quietly. "Brief window. But if you're caught—" "I wasn't here," Nyala finished for her. "You never saw me." The maid's smile was brittle. 20 years I've worked for the Ashfords. Never seen the old man so angry as when Callum chose you." Nyala absorbed this, understanding dawning. "You're helping because you care about Callum." "He was always kind," the maid said simply, "even as a boy. Unlike his father." She checked her watch. "Hurry now. Take the service corridors. Avoid the main halls." Disguised in the black uniform, hair tucked under a plain cap, Nyala slipped from her luxurious prison into the labyrinthine service passages of the Ashford mansion. The maid's map proved invaluable as she navigated a complex network designed specifically to keep servants invisible to the mansion's occupants. At precisely noon, she positioned herself near the East Wing entrance, heart pounding as she watched guards exchange brief reports before one group departed, leaving a momentary gap in coverage. Moving with deliberate purpose, the best way to avoid suspicion the maid had advised, Nyala strode down the corridor as if she belonged there. The final door was her greatest challenge, a heavy electronic lock requiring a code she didn't possess. Studying it desperately, Nyala noticed something familiar about the keypad. It was identical to the one Callum used for his secure office. He had shared that code with her 2 weeks ago, a gesture of trust that had touched her deeply at the time. Could Austin have used the same system? Would the code be something significant to both father and son? Acting on instinct, Nyala punched in the date of Callum's mother's death, a date he had mentioned once with quiet grief. The light flashed green. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Heart racing, she slipped inside, finding herself in a suite similar to her own, but larger, more masculine in its furnishings. And there, standing at a window, looking out at perfectly manicured grounds, was Callum. He turned at the sound of the door, his body instantly tensing for confrontation. The bruise along his jaw had darkened, his split lip partially healed, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams, widened in shock as he recognized her beneath the servant's disguise. "Nyala!" Disbelief and hope warred in his voice. "How did you—" "We don't have much time," she interrupted, rushing to him. The feel of his arms closing around her, solid and real, nearly undid her composure. "Guards change at noon. Brief window." Callum pulled back, framing her face with gentle hands. "You shouldn't have come. If he finds you, he'll kill me anyway," she finished bluntly. "I heard the maids talking. Once you agree to marry Lady Evelyn, I become inconvenient." Pain flashed across his features. "I would never agree." "I know," she said, cutting him off with a quick kiss. "That's why we're leaving. Now." Callum's expression shifted to determination. "There's a service elevator. Father thinks I don't remember it from childhood, but I used to sneak down to the kitchens at night. Through here." He led her to what appeared to be a solid wall, pressing a concealed mechanism that caused a panel to slide open. Beyond lay a narrow corridor and an ancient service elevator. "It leads to the garage level," he explained as they stepped inside. "From there, we can take one of the staff vehicles. Security doesn't check them. The elevator descended with an ominous creak. Nyala's pulse raced as she mentally calculated how much time had passed since the guard change. 5 minutes? 10? How long before someone checked Callum's room and raised the alarm? The garage was vast, housing dozens of vehicles from luxury cars to service vans. Callum moved with purpose toward an unassuming maintenance truck parked near a service exit. Keys should be... He reached above the sun visor, triumph flashing in his eyes as keys tumbled into his palm. Still predictable after all these years. As the garage door opened automatically for the maintenance vehicle, Nyala held her breath, expecting alarms, guards, some last-minute intervention. But they rolled into the sunshine without challenge, passing through the estate's outer gate with nothing more than a distracted wave from a security guard who barely glanced at Callum's hunched figure behind the wheel. "He'll realize soon," Callum said grimly as they accelerated down the private road, leading away from the estate. "We need to ditch this vehicle, find another way to travel." "Where are we going?" Nyala asked, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were fugitives now, hunted by one of the most powerful men in the world. Callum's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Somewhere Austin Ashford would never think to look for his cosmopolitan son. His eyes met hers briefly. "Your village." The suggestion stunned her. "My village. After everything that's happened, after my uncle's betrayal." "Your uncle betrayed us," Callum corrected. "Not the entire village. And there's something Austin doesn't understand about traditional communities. They protect their own." "I'm not sure I qualify as their own anymore," Nyala said bitterly. Callum reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're the granddaughter of their most respected diviner. Blood of their blood. Whatever conflicts exist, they run less deep than the bonds of generations." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe her people would protect them despite everything. But doubt gnawed at her. "There's something else you should know," Callum said, his tone shifting. "About Eveline." Nyala tensed. The beautiful, sophisticated woman Austin had mentioned. Callum's supposed fiancée. "The arrangement was made when I was 17, he explained, eyes fixed on the road. "A business merger disguised as a marriage. I never agreed to it, never proposed to her. By the time I was old enough to refuse outright, I'd already left, built my own life away from his influence." Relief washed through Nyala, followed quickly by lingering doubt. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't real to me," he replied simply. "It was just another of my father's manipulations, not worth mentioning. I should have realized he would use it against us." The maintenance truck rattled over a country road, putting miles between them and the Ashford estate. According to Callum, they were in a remote area 3 hours from the nearest major airport. 3 hours before they could lose themselves in the anonymity of crowds, find alternative transportation, begin the long journey back to her homeland. "There's a small airfield my father doesn't know about," Callum explained as they abandoned the truck in a dense forest, continuing on foot through wilderness. "A friend from college runs charter flights. If we can reach him..." "And if we can't?" Nyala asked, the reality of their desperate gamble sinking in. Callum's expression hardened with determination. "Then, we keep moving, keep fighting. I won't let him win, Nyala. I won't let him hurt you." The simple declaration warmed something deep within her. Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the revelations about his past, she believed him, trusted him, perhaps even loved him, though she wasn't ready to give that feeling a name. As night fell, they reached the small airfield Callum had described. His friend, a weather-beaten pilot named Marcus, asked no questions when Callum pressed a valuable watch into his hand and requested immediate departure. "Where to?" was all he asked, eyeing their disheveled appearance with professional disinterest. Callum looked to Nyala, the question in his eyes clear. This was her choice. her homeland, her people who might welcome or reject them. "Home," she said firmly, "to my village." Hours later, as their small aircraft soared above clouds turned golden by sunrise, Nyala rested her head on Callum's shoulder. They had escaped for now. Austin's resources were vast, his reach extensive. But they had something Austin Ashford couldn't understand or counter: the ancient protection of her people's traditions. If the village accepted them, declared them under sacred protection, not even Austin's wealth could breach that defense. The question was whether the village would extend that protection to the woman who had defied their expectations, and the outsider who had claimed her as wife. As mountains appeared on the horizon, her mountains, the ancient guardians of her people, Nyala felt Callum's arm tighten around her. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we face it together." She nodded, determination replacing fear. They had gambled everything on this desperate escape. Now they would gamble everything on the mercy and protection of a community that had once cast her out. But this time, Nyala wasn't returning as a shamed daughter, seeking forgiveness. She was returning as a woman who had chosen her path, her partner, a woman whose divining blood had recognized truth when others saw only convenience. This time, she wouldn't beg for acceptance. This time, she would demand it. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Betrayal. Stone walls and iron gates isolated the Ashford mansion from the outside world, a monument to wealth built to intimidate rather than welcome. For 3 days since their capture and transport to this distant country estate, Nyala had been kept in luxurious isolation, permitted only brief supervised walks through manicured gardens. She had glimpsed Callum just once, during an elaborate dinner staged by Austin. Across the formal dining table with its excessive silver and crystal, Callum had seemed a stranger, his eyes distant, responses mechanical, as if some essential part of him had been locked away. "The master knows exactly how to handle his son," the sympathetic maid had whispered while delivering Nyala's breakfast. "It's been this way since the boy was small. Resistance, then compliance. Always the same pattern." Today, their 4th day in captivity, servants whispered about tomorrow's gala where Austin would announce Callum's return to family responsibilities and his engagement to Evelyn Harrington, heiress to a shipping empire that would complement Ashford Industries perfectly. Engagement. The word had pierced Nyala like a blade. Had everything between them been manipulation? A temporary rebellion against his true destiny? She had to know. Using the servant's uniform smuggled to her by the sympathetic maid, Nyala slipped from her quarters during shift change, making her way through memorized corridors toward the east wing where Callum was kept under stricter surveillance. The sound of conversation from a partially open door made her pause. A woman's voice, cultured with the precise diction of expensive education, drifted into the hallway. "Did you truly believe your father would simply let you go?" the voice asked. "That I would." Nyala edged closer to the gap, her heart racing as she peered inside. The room was an elegant sitting room with antique furniture and priceless art. Callum stood by a marble fireplace, his posture rigid with tension. Across from him sat a woman who embodied aristocratic beauty. Golden hair arranged in an artful twist, skin like porcelain, diamonds sparkling at her throat and wrists. "What we had was over long before I left, Evelyn," Callum replied, his tone carefully controlled. Evelyn. The name sent a shock of recognition through Nyala. The woman Austin intended for his son. Was it? Evelyn rose with liquid grace, her silk dress catching the light as she moved toward Callum. "The invitations to our engagement gala were at the printer when you vanished." She laughed, the sound like wind chimes, beautiful but hollow. "Do you have any idea what that cost me socially? The whispers, the pity." "An arrangement between our fathers is not an engagement," Callum countered. "You never loved me, Evelyn." "Love?" She arched one elegant eyebrow. How charmingly provincial. We had something far more valuable. Compatibility, shared background, mutual benefit. She moved closer, her gaze assessing. Not like your village experiment. The dismissal of everything they had shared, their binding ceremony, their growing connection, their desperate escape, reduced to a condescending phrase, made Nyala's blood boil. "Nyala is my wife," Callum stated, his voice gaining strength. "A tribal ritual hardly constitutes legal marriage," Eveline replied, circling him with practiced calculation. "Besides, she served her purpose, didn't she? Your ultimate act of rebellion against Austin." Her voice hardened. "But the tantrum is over. The company needs stability. The board is restless. Our families require this alliance." Nyala's fingernails dug into her palms. She should leave, maintain her cover, find another way to reach Callum. But something held her in place, needing to hear his response. "You never knew me, Eveline," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not the real me. You saw what you wanted, the heir, the business partner, the trophy husband." "And what did she see?" Eveline challenged, her composure slipping for the first time. "This village woman who supposedly understands you after a few weeks better than I do after 2 decades. The question hung in the air between them. Nyala held her breath, waiting for his answer. For several heartbeats, Callum remained silent, seemingly gathering his thoughts. Each second of hesitation cut deeper than Nyala expected. "She saw me," he finally said. "Not the Ashford name or fortune. Just me." Something flickered across Eveline's face, perhaps genuine hurt, quickly masked by calculation. "Sweet sentiment," she murmured, stepping toward him. Her hand rose to rest lightly on his arm. "But sentiment doesn't build empires." Callum looked down at her hand but didn't immediately remove it. Nyala felt a stab of doubt. Their history was evident. Years of shared experiences she could never match. "Consider what we could create together," Eveline continued, her voice softening to intimate persuasion. "Harrington Shipping combined with Ashford Industries. Market dominance across 6 continents. Legacy that would outlive us by generations." "Built on weapons manufacturing," Callum challenged, finally stepping away from her touch. "Environmental devastation. Labor exploitation. That's not legacy, Eveline. That's destruction wearing a respectable face." Eveline's expression hardened, the socialite mask dropping to reveal the ruthless businesswoman beneath. "This is the real world, Callum. Not some idealistic fantasy. In business, results eclipse methods every time." "That's where you're wrong," Callum replied with quiet conviction. "Methods define who we are. The choices we make when profit conflicts with principle, that's the measure of a person." The floorboards beneath Nyala's feet creaked as she shifted her weight. Both heads turned toward the sound, Callum's eyes widening with recognition, Eveline's narrowing with calculation. "Nyala," Callum breathed, moving toward the door. "Well," Eveline drawled, recovering instantly. "The tribal bride herself. How appropriate." She pressed a discreet button on the wall. "Security will be delighted to find our wandering guest." Nyala stepped back, but it was too late. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, his hand moving to his radio upon spotting her servant disguise. "Identification," he demanded curtly. Before she could respond, a new voice interrupted from behind her. "She's with me." Austin Ashford approached, his measured steps unhurried, his cold smile never reaching his eyes. Despite his age, he carried himself with the dangerous confidence of a predator who always caught his prey. "Ms. Adebayo," he acknowledged, as if finding her was the most natural thing in the world. "I see you've met Lady Eveline Harrington." "Your plans for Callum's future," Nyala replied, refusing to show fear. "His rightful future," Austin corrected smoothly. "The one he was born and educated for." Callum emerged fully from the sitting room, positioning himself beside Nyala. A future I rejected years ago. A temporary rebellion, Austin dismissed, now ended. He gestured to the guards. Escort them to my study. We'll resolve this family matter properly. The journey through the mansion's corridors was brief but tense, guards flanking them on either side. Austin's study projected calculated intimidation, hunting trophies from endangered species, ancestral portraits of stern-faced Ashfords, and a massive desk that dominated the space like a general's command center. Austin seated himself behind the imposing desk, Evelyn standing at his right hand in perfect symbolic alignment. Neela and Callum remained standing before them, the power dynamic deliberately established. Your situation is simple, Austin stated. Callum will resume his position as heir, sign the merger agreement with Harrington Shipping, and announce his engagement to Evelyn tomorrow evening. And if I refuse? Callum challenged. Austin's smile chilled the room. Then the evidence I've prepared showing you embezzled company funds, shared proprietary technology with competitors, and violated international sanctions becomes public. You destroy your own son's reputation. Nyala couldn't contain her disbelief. I'd preserve the Ashford legacy, Austin corrected coldly, one way or another. And what happens to Nyala in this scenario? Callum asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Austin waved dismissively. Generous compensation, enough to transform her entire village, if she wishes. And if that's not acceptable, Nyala pressed, sensing the threat beneath the false generosity. Then evidence linking you to eco-terrorism targeting Ashford operations will surface, Austin replied with chilling calm. Most developing nations have rather severe penalties for such crimes. The threat was unmistakable. Callum's compliance or Nyala's destruction. She doesn't belong in your world, Evelyn added, her voice almost sympathetic despite her cutting words. I am your match, Callum. Your equal in every way that matters in our society. Nyala lifted her chin, refusing to be diminished. I don't need your validation, she told Evelyn before turning to Callum. Make your choice, but know this. I won't be anyone's sacrifice. The room fell silent as Callum looked between Evelyn's confident expression and his father's expectant gaze. Then, before them all, he did the unthinkable. He knelt before Nyala. I don't want power, he said, voice steady and clear. I don't want wealth. I only want you. Austin's face contorted with rage. Evelyn's composure cracked into naked disbelief. You choose her, Austin roared, rising from his chair. This nobody over your birthright. I choose love over greed, Callum answered simply. Freedom over control. Austin's hand moved to his desk drawer, withdrawing a gleaming letter opener with the Ashford crest on its handle. Then you choose death, he hissed. As the blade caught the light, Nyala realized with startling clarity that the ultimate betrayal wasn't Evelyn's manipulation or Austin's threats. It was a father willing to kill his own son rather than let him live freely. Chapter 8. A Battle for Love. Austin lunged forward, dagger glinting in the study's low light. Nyala reacted with instincts honed from years of hunting in the mountains, shoving Callum aside and grabbing a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk. She deflected Austin's strike, the blade barely missing her forearm. Guards, Austin bellowed, but Callum was already moving, tackling the nearest security man with surprising force. Run, Nyala, he shouted, wrestling the guard's weapon away and using his body as a shield against the others who converged. The room erupted into chaos. Evelyn screamed, diving behind a leather chair as Nyala kicked out at a second guard, sending him crashing into a bookshelf filled with auction trophies. Glass shattered, ancient artifacts tumbling to the floor as Nyala looked desperately for an escape route. Austin came at her again, his aristocratic veneer stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "You destroyed everything," he snarled, eyes wild with fury. "Turned my own son against me." "You did that yourself," Nyala countered, dodging his next thrust and overturning a side table between them. Across the room, Callum fought with desperate intensity, his movements precise despite his split lip reopening, fresh blood staining his chin. The training of his youth, boxing at elite boarding schools, fencing at university, combined with raw determination as he battled toward Nyala. When Austin lunged again, Nyala sidestepped, using his momentum to send him sprawling across his desk. Papers and electronic devices crashed to the floor. She grabbed for the dagger, but Austin recovered too quickly, slashing wildly and catching her arm. Pain lanced through her as blood bloomed on her sleeve. "Nyala!" Callum's anguished cry cut through the chaos. In his moment of distraction, a guard tackled him from behind, driving him to the floor with brutal force. Austin stood, breathing heavily, dagger now pointed at his own son's throat. "Enough!" he commanded. "This ends now!" Time seemed to slow as Nyala watched Austin's hand tighten on the dagger. In that moment, something ancient and powerful awakened within her, her grandmother's divining gift, stronger than it had ever been. With perfect clarity, she saw what would happen next, saw Austin's blade descending, saw Callum's life draining away, saw her own future shattering into endless grief. "No!" The word tore from her throat as she lunged forward, her movements guided by something beyond conscious thought. Her hand closed around an ancient ceremonial spear displayed on Austin's wall, its weight familiar as if she had trained with it all her life. With one fluid motion, she swung it toward Austin, not to kill, but to disarm. The carved shaft struck his wrist with precision, sending the dagger flying across the room. Austin howled in pain and rage as more guards converged on Nyala. "The window!" Callum shouted, breaking free from his captor with renewed strength. He grabbed a chair, hurling it through the study's massive window. Glass shattered outward, the night air rushing in. Without hesitation, Nyala followed as he vaulted through the opening. They landed on a sloped roof below, scrambling for purchase on slick tiles. Guards shouted above them, searchlights beginning to sweep the grounds. "This way," Callum gasped, guiding her toward a maintenance ladder barely visible in the darkness. They descended in frantic haste, alarms now blaring throughout the estate. The grounds were massive, but Callum moved with purpose, leading her through gardens and past security points, with the confidence of someone who had once planned this exact escape. "Service entrance," he panted as they reached a high wall. "There's a gap in the security system. If we time it right." A shout from behind cut him short. Guards had spotted them, were closing in fast. "Go!" Callum pushed her toward a narrow opening in the wall. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you." Nyala seized his hand, pulling him with her as bullets struck the wall around them. They squeezed through the gap together, emerging onto a service road where delivery trucks came and went. In the distance, the main gates were closing, security lights flooding the entire perimeter. "We'll never make it," Nyala gasped, clutching her bleeding arm. "We don't need to," Callum replied, pulling her toward a small outbuilding. Inside sat a motorcycle, covered in dust but obviously maintained. My secret escape plan, one my father never discovered. Moments later, they roared down a hidden trail that skirted the property, the wind whipping tears from Nyala's eyes as she clung to Callum's bloodied back. Behind them, sirens wailed and searchlights swept uselessly through the trees. They had escaped, bruised, bloodied, but alive. And now Callum was a man without a home, without a name, without the empire that should have been his birthright. Hours later, at a small roadside motel far from Austin's reach, Nyala cleaned the cut above Callum's eye with gentle hands. "You chose me," she said softly, still struggling to believe what had happened in that study. You gave up everything." "I gave up nothing that matters," Callum replied, wincing slightly as she dabbed antiseptic on his wound. "Everything I want is right here." Nyala paused, the question that had haunted her since the confrontation finally spilling out. "What about Evelyn?" "You hesitated when she asked what I saw in you that she didn't." Pain that had nothing to do with his injuries flashed across Callum's face. "I wasn't hesitating about my choice, Nyala. I was realizing how little she ever knew me, how little anyone knew me before you." "She seemed so perfect," Nyala admitted, the elegant blonde's dismissive words still stinging. "So certain of her place in your world." "Her place in my father's world," Callum corrected. "A world I've been trying to escape since I was 18. His hand covered hers, stilling her movements. "You saw me, Nyala. Not the heir, not the businessman. Me." The simple truth of it washed over her, healing something that had fractured during those moments of doubt. Whatever forces had drawn them together, diviner's gift, ancestral guidance, or simple chance, they had chosen each other when it mattered most. Callum's phone buzzed, a burner they'd purchased at a truck stop. The message displayed was from his most trusted security man. "AA in hospital. Heart episode. Legal team mobilizing. All assets frozen." "My father suffered a heart attack," Callum explained, showing her the screen. "Likely brought on by tonight's events." "Will he survive?" Nyala asked, surprised by her own concern for a man who had tried to kill them both. "Probably. He's too stubborn to die easily." Callum's mouth twisted in a complicated expression. "But this changes everything. While he's incapacitated, his enemies within the company will move against him. The legal team will be too busy protecting corporate assets to hunt us. So we're safe? For now?" "Not here," Callum replied, wincing as he stood. "My father has allies everywhere. We need to go somewhere he'd never think to look for me." Nyala knew the answer before he said it, felt it in her bones, in the blood that connected her to generations of ancestors. "My village," she said quietly. "My people." Fear and hope mingled in her chest at the thought. Return to the community that had rejected her. Ask for sanctuary from those who had cast her out. "They're your family, Nyala," Callum said gently, reading her hesitation. "Whatever conflicts exist." "They chose traditions over me," she interrupted. "My own parents turned away." "Then we make them see." Determination hardened his voice. "We show them what real family means, what love means." As dawn broke outside their shabby motel room, Nyala felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Callum was right. It was time to return home, not as the shamed daughter seeking forgiveness, but as a woman who had fought for her choices, who had been willing to die for love. This time, when she faced her village, she wouldn't come alone. This time she would bring a man who had chosen her over everything: wealth, power, birthright. This time she belonged to no one but herself. Chapter 9: Love Without Chains. The journey back to Nyala's homeland took weeks, changing identities, zigzagging across borders, always watchful for Austin's agents. Though his health crisis had temporarily diverted attention, they knew the respite wouldn't last. Eventually, Austin would recover and resume his hunt. His pride would accept nothing less. During those weeks of travel, their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated. In shabby hotels and overnight buses, they shared stories of their childhoods, Nyala's filled with community and tradition, Callum's with wealth and isolation. They discovered shared values beneath vastly different experiences: a reverence for heritage, a commitment to creating rather than consuming, a desire to leave the world better than they found it. When they finally crossed the border into her country, Nyala felt the mountains calling her home. Beside her, Callum had changed, his designer clothes replaced by worn denim and practical boots, his polished accent softened by weeks, conversing with locals in various languages. But his eyes remained the same, storm gray and steadfast in their devotion. The village appeared unchanged as they approached on foot, having abandoned their final borrowed vehicle miles back. Children played by the sacred river. Women gathered at the communal well. Elders sat beneath the ancient baobab tree, passing judgment and wisdom in equal measure. But as they entered the village square, all activity ceased. Silence fell like a physical weight as people turned to stare at the prodigal daughter and her foreign companion. Nyala. Her mother emerged from the crowd, face unreadable. "You have returned." "With him," someone muttered disapprovingly. "The outsider." Elder Amara stepped forward, her ancient eyes taking in their travel-worn appearance, the protective way Callum positioned himself slightly behind Nyala, present but allowing her to lead. "You seek sanctuary," the old woman said. "Not a question. We seek home," Nyala corrected gently. "For both of us." Murmurs rippled through the gathered villagers. Nyala spotted her uncle Ikine at the edge of the crowd, his face dark with anger. But he made no move to approach. The shame of his betrayal had diminished his standing. A man with white skin, a foreign name, a noble past, Elder Kamau observed, coming to stand beside Amara. "He doesn't belong here." Before Nyala could argue, Callum stepped forward. "I come with respect," he said, his voice clear and carrying. "Not to change or conquer, but to learn. To belong, if you'll teach me how." "Pretty words," someone called, but the last outsider who spoke so prettily stole our sacred lands. "I haven't come to take," Callum replied. "I've come to give." From his worn backpack, he withdrew a folded document, offering it to Elder Kamau with both hands, the traditional gesture of respect. The elder unfolded it slowly, eyes widening as he read. "This is," he began, then stopped, looking at Callum with new assessment. "The deed to the Tower lands," Callum confirmed. "Transferred to the village trust. My father's lawyers can't touch it now." Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. The Tower lands, prime real estate at the mountain's base, worth millions. "Why would you do this?" Elder Amara asked, suspicion evident in her tone. "Because they were never mine to keep," Callum answered simply. "And because I love your daughter." The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Nyala stepped forward, taking his hand. "I choose him," she announced, "not because of tradition or ceremony, but because of who he is, who we are together." Elder Kamau exchanged glances with the other elders. The binding ceremony was valid under sacred law. "Despite your uncle's attempt to change this, you remain married." "We are bound by more than ceremony now," Nyala replied. "We've fought together, suffered together, chosen each other freely." "And if we deny you sanctuary?" Elder Amara asked. "If we reject the outsider?" Nyala stood taller. "Then we leave together. I won't be separated from him again." A long silence followed as the village absorbed this ultimatum. Then, unexpectedly, Nyala's mother stepped forward. "My daughter speaks with the diviner's voice," she said, her eyes meeting Nyala's with newfound respect. "She has her grandmother's gift, to see truth where others see only surface." One by one, villagers began to nod. Not all, some turned away, disapproval etched in their features. But enough to create space for something new to grow. Elder Amara finally sighed, the sound ancient as the mountains themselves. "The outsider may stay, on probation. He must learn our ways, participate in our traditions, prove himself worthy of the gift he's been given." "I will," Callum promised, gratitude evident in every line of his body. The seasons turned. Spring blossomed into summer. Summer mellowed into harvest time. Through it all, Callum worked tirelessly to earn his place in the village. He learned the language, stumbling at first, but growing more confident each day. He joined the men in the fields, his pale skin burning, then gradually darkening under the relentless sun. He sat at the elders' feet, absorbing their stories, their wisdom, showing respect without servility. Most importantly, he never tried to change them, never suggested improvements or modernizations. Instead, he adapted himself to their rhythm, finding his place within the ancient patterns of village life. It wasn't easy. Some villagers remained coldly distant. Some tested him deliberately, setting impossible tasks or excluding him from important ceremonies. Through it all, Callum persevered with a quiet dignity that gradually won respect, if not universal acceptance. When Austin's men came, as they inevitably did, the village stood united, turning them away with the quiet power of communal resistance. No individual could be bribed or threatened when all stood as one. On the night of the harvest moon, exactly 1 year after their return, the village gathered beneath golden lantern light for the festival. The same festival where, unknowingly, Nyala had bound herself to Callum all those months ago. This time, everything was different. This time, they stood before the elders with clear eyes and full hearts. Callum knelt before Nyala, offering the traditional token, carved wood wrapped in red thread, but crafted by his own hands. The design a perfect blend of his artistic sensibility and village tradition. Nyala Adebayo, he said, using her birth name with deliberate significance. I ask you now with clear mind and free choice. Will you be my wife? Not because of ceremony or circumstance, but because we choose each other every day for all days to come. Tears glimmered in Nyala's eyes as she accepted the token. Yes, she answered, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. I choose you, Callum, today and all days. The cheer that rose from the village wasn't universal. There were still those who stood silent, but it was genuine. Acceptance hard-won and therefore precious. Later, as they danced beneath the harvest moon, bodies moving in perfect synchronicity to the ancient drums, Nyala caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the firelight. A familiar silhouette, the outline of her grandmother, watching with approval before fading back into shadow. Did you see that? She whispered to Callum. He followed her gaze, seeing nothing but knowing better than to doubt. Your grandmother? Nyala nodded. She knew. All along, she knew we would find each other. Through fire and flight, Callum murmured, drawing her closer. Through lies and truth. Through freedom and choice, Nyala finished, rising on tiptoe to kiss him beneath the watchful gaze of the harvest moon and all her ancestors. Love without chains, partnership without possession, a future written not by others' expectations, but by their own joined hands. Chapter 10. The Final Choice. 3 years passed since that harvest festival night when Nyala and Callum chose each other freely before the entire village. 3 years of building a life that bridged two worlds without diminishing either. They had constructed a home at the edge of the village, modern in its amenities, but traditional in its design, built with local materials and village hands. Callum had established a foundation that funded education for village children while preserving cultural practices. Nyala had developed her grandmother's divining gift, becoming a respected voice not only in her village, but in neighboring communities as well. Their life wasn't perfect. Austin Ashford remained a distant threat, his resources occasionally deployed in new attempts to reclaim his son or punish his defiance. Some villagers still viewed Callum with suspicion, still whispered about impurity when they thought Nyala couldn't hear. But these challenges only strengthened their bond, only confirmed the rightness of their choice. On the morning of the spring equinox, Nyala woke before dawn, slipping silently from the bed she shared with her husband. Something had called to her in dreams. Her grandmother's voice, urgent and clear. Go to the sacred pool, granddaughter. Today is the day of reckoning. The sacred pool lay deep in the mountain forest, its crystalline waters fed by ancient springs. Only diviners and elders typically visited its shores, seeking visions or conducting the most solemn ceremonies. Nyala hadn't been there since her grandmother's funeral, where the old woman's ashes had been committed to the waters. As first light touched the eastern sky, Nyala reached the pool's edge. The surface was unnaturally still, reflecting the emerging stars like a perfect mirror. She knelt, trailing her fingers through the cool water, waiting for whatever vision had summoned her. I knew you would come. The voice behind her sent ice down her spine. Nyala whirled to find Austin Ashford standing at the forest's edge, looking strangely diminished in the wilderness setting despite his expensive outdoor clothing. His face was thinner than she remembered, lined with new creases, but his eyes remained coldly calculating. How did you find this place? She demanded, rising to her feet. The sacred pool was known only to her people, its location protected for generations. Money opens many doors, Austin replied with a dismissive wave, even doors that should remain closed. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. Someone from the village betrayed us. Again. Human nature is remarkably consistent, he observed dryly. Everyone has a price. Nyala's hands clenched at her sides, rage building within her. Not just for herself and Callum, but for her people, for this sacred place now defiled by Austin's presence. What do you want? She asked, though she already knew. Austin stepped closer, his boots crushing delicate forest flowers without notice. To end this foolishness, to bring my son home where he belongs. He is home, Nyala countered. This is where he belongs now. Playing native in some primitive village? Austin scoffed. Wasting his potential, his education, his birthright. This isn't a life for an Ashford. It's the life he chose. Because you bewitched him, Austin's voice hardened. Used whatever tribal superstitions you practice to turn him against his family, his duty. The accusation was so absurd, Nyala might have laughed if the situation weren't so dangerous. Your son left you long before he met me. He built his own life, his own company, specifically to escape your control. A temporary rebellion, Austin dismissed, until you trapped him with that ceremony. The only trap Callum ever faced was your expectations, Nyala replied evenly. Your demands that he become a copy of you, ruthless, cold, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for power. Austin's expression tightened. You know nothing about me, girl. I know enough. Nyala took a deliberate step forward, no longer intimidated by this man who had once seemed so formidable. I know you would threaten your own son with death, rather than let him make his own choices. I know you would violate sacred spaces and corrupt vulnerable people to get your way. I built an empire, Austin snapped, created a legacy that should have continued through generations. Everything I did, everything, was to secure Callum's future. No, a new voice interrupted. Everything you did was to control it. Callum emerged from the forest path, his expression grim as he moved to stand beside Nyala. She wasn't surprised he had followed her. Their connection had deepened over the years, each increasingly attuned to the other's movements, thoughts, needs. Son. Something almost like emotion flickered across Austin's face. You look well. I am well, Callum confirmed. Happier than I've ever been. Austin's gaze traveled between them, calculating as ever. This has gone on long enough. The board is restless, the company's direction uncertain. It's time to come home. I am home, Callum repeated Nyala's words, his hand finding hers. But you already know that. This isn't about the company or the board. It's about your pride. A muscle ticked in Austin's jaw. Think of your mother, what she would want for you. It was a low blow using Callum's beloved mother, dead 15 years now. But to Nyala's surprise, Callum smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression. "I think of her every day," he said, "and I know exactly what she would want. For me to be happy, to build something meaningful, to love deeply." He squeezed Nyala's hand. "She would have loved my wife, my home, my choice." Something cracked in Austin's carefully maintained facade. For a moment, just a moment, Nyala glimpsed the lonely, aging man beneath the power and wealth, the father who had lost his son, not through mystical influence, but through his own unyielding nature. "This is your final choice, then?" Austin asked, his voice suddenly older, wearier. "It was made long ago," Callum replied gently. "The only question is whether you can accept it." Austin looked past them to the sacred pool, its waters now illuminated by morning light. Something in his expression shifted, as if he were seeing not just water but all it represented: tradition, continuity, values beyond material wealth. "Your mother came from a small village, did you know?" he said unexpectedly. "Not unlike this one. Before I met her, before I changed her." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications neither Nyala nor Callum had suspected. "Perhaps," Austin continued, the words seeming forced from him, "perhaps I've been fighting the wrong battle. Perhaps legacy isn't what I thought." He straightened his shoulders with visible effort, the businessman reasserting control. "The Ashford Industries Board meets next quarter. I'll expect your proxy vote on the sustainability initiatives, at least." It was as close to acceptance as he could offer, not warm embrace, not blessing, but acknowledgement. Recognition that Callum had made his choice, and that choice would stand. "I'll review the proposals," Callum agreed, professional respect replacing personal conflict. Austin nodded once, sharply, then turned to leave. At the forest's edge, he paused, not quite looking back. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly, then disappeared among the trees. Silence fell over the sacred pool, broken only by birdsong and the gentle lap of water against stone. Nyala released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, leaning into Callum's solid presence beside her. "It's over," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Not over," Callum corrected, turning to face her fully. "Just beginning properly, without shadows, without pursuit." As sunrise gilded the water before them, Nyala felt her grandmother's presence, not as ghost or vision, but as wisdom continuing through generations. The diviner who had perhaps seen this moment years ago, who had guided her granddaughter's dreams toward a stranger with storm-gray eyes. "We chose well," Nyala said, resting her head against Callum's shoulder. "We choose well," he amended, emphasizing the present tense. Every day, every moment. Around them, the forest stirred with new life, the eternal cycle of renewal that had continued long before their story began and would continue long after. But for now, in this moment of perfect understanding, they stood together at the center of their own creation. A love forged in fire, tested by betrayal, and ultimately freed from all chains, save those they willingly placed upon themselves. Choice, the respect, partnership, the true foundations of love that neither duty nor tradition nor power could command. They had found their way home,